Thank you for inviting me. It was Professor Schlapeta, I guess, who said that he came to talk about Baltic states, but there was so much about Czechoslovakia. I'm going to fill the gap between the Baltic states and Czechoslovakia, talking mainly about Poland, and especially about one place, the city of Krakow, by many people seen as a kind of a cradle, the nest of this very country, but in many ways the city might be seen also as a kind of a place of invented traditions, invented myths. And from this perspective, my presentation will not be so much about the modern architecture. I'm going to present some of that, but I'm going to talk much more about modernity in the conditions of Krakow. At first, let us look at the main new achievement of the interwar Krakow, namely the Three Poets Boulevard, one named by Zygmunt Krasiński, one named by Adam Mickiewicz, and one named by Juliusz Słowacki. Three most important Romantic era poets. We are now in Kaunas. Almost 200 years ago, Adam Mickiewicz started to work on Dziady, one of his masterpieces here in Kaunas. So let's look at Adam Mickiewicz Street, Boulevard that we have in Krakow. The place that reflects the fact that the city of Krakow, these days about 200,000 people city, was one of the winners of the Second Republic of Poland. The country that not emerged from the scratch, it was not the new country, it was the kind of a resurrection after more than 100 years of being erased from the map, and the country that was a little bit different than many other in the region after 1918. It was built of three pieces, one governed by Germany, earlier Prussia, another one governed by Austria, and another one governed by Russia. So it was a kind of a Frankenstein product of political discourse of the era, and this new concept, new political entity was very different, with completely different railway system, with completely different post system, with a different types of administration, and many other similar issues were also quite problematic. But what was already there in the early 1920s was a kind of a common mythology and common symbolics that was keeping at least a big part of the society together. Not the entire society for sure, but at least big part of it. And this mythology and symbolics in many ways was quite strongly connected to the city of Krakow. Please look at the same site just 20 few years earlier. Here you can see the drawings by Stanisław Wyspiański, one of the leading Polish poets and designers and painters of the early 20th century. And here's the view from his window towards the Kościuszko Mount, just 10 meters walk away from the middle-aged market square of the city of Krakow, not so far away from the city center. Still in the beginning of the 20th century, you can see completely empty space, not urbanized. It should to be emphasized that Krakow, for most of the 19th century, was a quite strange city. On the one hand side, it was a military camp of the Austrian army, just 8 kilometers away from the border with Russia, a very important military point on the Austrian and later on Austro-Hungarian map. And on the other hand side, it was a kind of a Monte Carlo or Las Vegas of the Polish gentry, bringing aristocrats from all over of non-existing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here is the line of the borders of the city, limits of the city. Outside of that, it was impossible to build anything. The territory was totally controlled by the army. So the situation has changed. Already before the World War I, and it was a big achievement of the local self-government of the city of Krakow. Few very brave mayors that I'm not going to repeat their long and difficult surnames were struggling for many years to achieve the goal and to extend the limits of the city and take over the territories that were not controlled by the city for a very long time. Maybe one more information, before 1910 the city of Krakow consists of 5.5 square kilometers of area and was inhabited with about 100,000 inhabitants, which meant that it was the densest populated city of Austro-Hungarian Empire. But these mayors and the local government of Krakow, already in the early 20th century, was strong enough to see the city as a very important artistic center. That's why already in the early days of the 20th century, Krakow saw the very strong development of arts, of plastic arts, as well as of the architecture, and the city saw a kind of a birth of national approach towards Art Nouveau, a kind of a mixture that somehow was lengthened until 1920s and 1930s. Here we can see one of the best achievements of that time. The mayors of the city, and especially one of them, Juliusz Leo, was clever enough and strong enough, playing on the level of the parliament in Vienna, to extend the limits of the city. And it was 1910 when the first urban plan competition was organized at the, let's say, Polish soil. It was the first Polish city that saw the idea to prepare the modern urban plan, and here's the winning entry of the competition, the one that was following the idea of the garden city. 2 years later, Ebenezer Howard visited Krakow and highly appreciated this very plan. I don't know if he was kind or if he really thought that, but anyway, there are some evidence that something like that happened. And I'm mentioning this information from the times before the World War I just to present the city of the very limited opportunities without actually economical significance, located in the outskirts, just next to the border with Russia, but the city which became already in the 19th century quite important intellectual center, which was reflected also in architecture and arts. And here we have, and here we can see the main pavilion of the exhibition, one of the very first in Poland, modern exhibitions dedicated to architecture, exhibition of architecture and interiors in garden settings. Polish architects and Krakowian architects of this time were struggling with the idea what is the most typical for the Polish architecture, what might be a symbol of the national architecture. I should one again remind Adam Mickiewicz, another masterpiece by Adam Mickiewicz, Pan Tadeusz. Pan Tadeusz starts with depiction of the typical manor house, and this typical manor house was seen as a kind of a topos of the culture of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and was highly appreciated by the Polish gentry. So the idea of the architects of Krakow of early 20th century was to build a manor for everyone, manor for each citizen of the future state of Poles. But why this place is so important? Krakow, just before the World War I, became also a center of the political life, quite precisely managed by Austrians. In this very same city, one could see the Józef Piłsudski, maybe not very well seen here in Lithuania, person, the father figure of the Polish independence movement, but also actually not far away from here, it was Vladimir Lenin, who also lived in Krakow just before the World War I. And I'm mentioning this political meaning of the city that appeared in that era, just to say that the same building, 1913, was turned into a military barracks of the first squadron of the Polish army managed by Józef Piłsudski. And precisely from this very place, called Oleandry, the March for Independence of Poles started. And I'm mentioning that to reflect this idea of modern myths, modern mythologies, because it was a kind of a holy grail of independent Poland. In the 20s and 30s, this place became a kind of a sanctuary of independence, highly connected with the Józef Piłsudski cult of personality. And here is the coffin of Piłsudski. He passed away in 1935. For the 10 years before, he was actually a dictator of Poland. And the coffin is carried by two very close allies of Piłsudski. One of them is a marshal of the Polish army, Edward Rydz-Śmigły. Another one is a general, Kazimierz Sosnkowski. I'm mentioning them because both of them came from the quite specific background. They were not soldiers, they were artists. One of them studied fine arts, one of them studied architecture. And the army of Piłsudski, which consists of about 25,000 people, consists also of about 1,000 artists. And these artists in the 20s and 30s played an enormously important role in development of the state. Can you imagine the artist who is becoming the first leader of the police in the democratic country and has to establish first prisons? So there were such examples of careers in the Poland. Why I'm mentioning that? Some of the people who came from this place went to the military, but some of them went to the art. And here is the Art Academy in Warsaw, early 20s, totally colonized by the artists from Krakow. Those Art Nouveau-ish artists of early 20th century in the 20s became very serious officers of the state administration, having the role to establish the national iconography, national symbols. And here is Józef Czajkowski, the one who designed this very building. And here is Paris, 1925, and here's another manor, this time Cubist manor with the glass dome, Polish pavilion that won Grand Prix of this very Paris exhibition. A huge success of the Polish culture and the Polish art provided by the artists who these days were settled in Warsaw, but their roots were in Krakow. In the 20s and 30s, these artists played an enormously important role in establishment of national symbols in architecture all over the country. New buildings for the state administration in Warsaw, new ministries, Seimas, building of the parliament, among the others, were decorated, maybe not designed, but decorated by this very group of artists. Here we can see the biggest building of the Second Republic of Poland, Silesian Parliament in Katowice, a very hot and problematic place, topic of the conflict between Second Republic of Poland and the Weimar Republic, and the symbol of, let's say, colonization of Silesia by Poles. And the project was designed by Krakowian architects, mainly Ludwik Wojtyczko and Kazimierz Wyczeński. And let's go to the city of Krakow. As I told you already, the city of Krakow was a kind of a winner of the Second Republic. Economy changed in this country entirely. Some cities were losing, for instance, the city of Lviv, the city of Vilnius, the city of Łódź, but there were also the winners. First of all, Warsaw, the capital, but also some another, like Katowice already mentioned, Gdynia, like Poznań, and Krakow. 20s and 30s is a time of the very fast development, and here once again the avenue of Adam Mickiewicz, Adamos Mickiewiczius, and the new building of the Academy of Mining. These Art Nouveau-ish architects in the 20s, they changed the aesthetics. turning it into a kind of a neoclassical one, ornated with, it's maybe not so very visible in this image, ornated with mainly cubist-like, Art Deco-like decorations. And this aesthetics was later on called the Krakow School. And in the 30s, they developed a kind of a compromise between modernity and the need for decoration. Here is Jagiellonian Library, one of the last big achievements of the era. But in my last few minutes, I would like to say also a few words about the most important person representing the architecture of Krakow of the era. His name was Adolf Szyszko-Bohusz. As I told you, Krakow is a city of invented traditions, so one of the people who played a very important role in production of those mythologies was not from Krakow, he was actually from Estonia. He was born in Narva, not far away from Tallinn. His name was Adolf Szyszko-Bohusz. His family was very well connected to the Russian administration and Russian military. He was trained in St. Petersburg, and here you can see one of the best examples of Petersburg classicism that we have in Krakow. But this was his, let's say, approach of the early 20s, and here is Szyszko-Bohusz himself. Like many other architects and artists who I presented before, he was also one of the soldiers of Józef Piłsudski, and in the 20s and 30s he became one of the closest allies on the level of architecture of Piłsudski and his colleagues. In the 20s he was involved in the whole series of projects presenting new monumental Krakow. The Mount of Kościuszko, once again, visible in the axis of the arch designed by Szyszko-Bohusz at the place where Piłsudski's army was marching in 1914. This project was not completed, but the architect was involved in the project of the museum that was built in the late 30s. He was not the main designer, but he had some, let's say, influence on how it looked like in the end. Just next to the museum, not so far away to this direction, there is this place called Olandry, where Piłsudski's army started its operation, and in this very place, Szyszko-Bohusz, one of the soldiers, was invited to design the modern house of the dictator, the modern house of the leader of Józef Piłsudski. It was completed only partly, but here you can see how this aesthetics was changing, becoming more and more reflecting the ideas of functionalism. Szyszko-Bohusz, for a big part of his career, was connected with the restoration of the Wawel Castle in Krakow. His idea, his dream was to completely change the western part of the hill. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, he never had money to do so. So this project never appeared to build a kind of a sanctuary or altar of the nation to have a huge masses and meetings for thousands of people. For most of the period, he was completely overwhelmed with total redecoration of the Wawel Castle. Actually, it was him who designed the Renaissance architecture of this castle. Here you can see the reinforced concrete ceiling. Many people believe that it's from the 16th century, but it is actually not. And he was also invited to build one more sanctuary, mausoleum of Józef Piłsudski, built of spolias, columns taken from the demolished Orthodox Church in Warsaw, granite taken from the Bismarck Denkmal in Poznań, and metalworks taken from the Austrian canons. So a kind of a symbol of victory over three empires. And coming to the conclusion, I want to present one more building by Szyszko-Bohusz, namely the castle of the President of Poland. On the level of language of architecture, it could be named the oxymoron. something that simply does not exist. It's a castle built on the hill, built at the frontiers. The border with Czechoslovakia of these days was just a few kilometers away from this place, and the border with Germany was about 20 few kilometers. But it is also a building with the flat roof, bay windows, and especially with interior. I don't have an image with me right now, but the interior was full of Bauhaus-like furniture. And this building in many ways reflects the very specific approach towards modernity and modernism of the Krakow milieu of architects. We need to be modern, we need to be progressive, but we also want to be somehow attached to our tradition. And in the 20s and 30s, Krakow saw development of this very specific model, especially in the tenement buildings. There were plenty of them, of different kinds. It started with, let's say, neoclassical examples, then there were some Art Deco-like, representing this Krakow school, and with the time also functionalism was incorporated to the local tradition. Until today in Krakow you can find many tenements from the era. They have flat-like roofs, but also this kind of Baroque-like entrances, representing this invented tradition, invented mythology, for which the city of Krakow was extremely important. Even the first skyscrapers of the city might be seen as representing this type of the building. In the late 30s, there was a new generation of architects who came to the market. They were not so connected to this national, let's say, tradition, and they were much younger, much more progressive, but the conditions of the market were very tough, and to sustain in this market they had to follow the same type of the same model, presenting different ornamentations connected to the imagined past. And I'm talking about that to present some different approach, which in my opinion is quite typical for the Central European conditions, when modernism was a kind of a discussion, a kind of a compromise between various political conditions and various ideas that comes from, for instance, development of national discourse. And in this case, the city of Krakow might be seen as one of the most important sites, at least at the territory of Poland. And this is actually everything. Thank you so much.